Hi, I'm Ashley Barrientos, and this is my presentation over considerations for English language learning students and their evaluations. So our first question of the assignment is how or what do I feel about students who speak with different dialect, and how would that change my view of oral assessments for those students? I think it is so important that as educators, we are mindful of our students who may speak with a different dialect, especially those who speak of a different dialect of English. It is so important that we are remembering that they are, they're just speaking how they're accustomed to, how their culture, how their family, how their community speaks. And it is so important that we don't belittle that. We don't make standard English the end all be all, because it's not. I think it is so important that we are making sure that they know, they understand that we don't expect them to code switch. We know that code switching can be very detrimental to their mental health, to how they perceive themselves, how they perceive the world around them. So I think it is so important that we are mindful of that we are mindful of the differences, or rather, difference versus deficit. I think it is so important that we keep that in mind, that just because someone is speaking differently than us doesn't make it any less than how we speak. It doesn't make one better than the other. Also, I think as far as assessments are concerned, I think it is really important that we look at maybe how they speak compared to their classmates, maybe classmates of a similar demographic. I think it's important that we look at two assessments, maybe, um, what their score is versus how another classmate with the same sort of dialect would speak. I think it's so important that we do that. I think that as a whole, it should affect how we are assessing these students, but I think we need to do it in a very respectful manner, and I think that sometimes doesn't always happen. The second question of our assignment is asking what interventions are available for our ELL students if they need additional help or services. So with the interventions here, there are so many that one would see with any special education students, any student who has been identified as needing additional help, whether that is interventions before SPED services. But we can look at things like making sure as teachers that we are using multiple representations. We want to make sure that our students are not just hearing our words, but they're also seeing diagrams, they're seeing labels with visual representations as well. I think it's important that we use technology. Technology is all around us and it's just so beneficial. I was actually in a classroom once where a teacher had a student who was from Brazil. Her and her family had just moved. The students had been adopted, and when they got here, they spoke basically no English whatsoever. So her classroom teacher actually had a device. The student wore an earpiece, and the teacher would speak into her device, and it would translate from English into Portuguese. So I think it's important that we're looking at those technological advances that we can use inside of our classroom. With that, it's also important that we use audio textbooks, we use videos. We're making sure that we're using everything in our power, everything that we have available to us to help our students. We as educators should always make sure that we are using explicit instruction, that we are teaching that phonics in a structured and systematic way. I think it's also with that and with peer support, I think it's important with both of those factors, kind of falls under both of those, that we're supporting that native language that those students have. It's so important to make sure that that student doesn't feel like we don't want to recognize their native language. We want to make sure that they understand that that language is fantastic. That culture is fantastic. We want to make sure we're supporting that. We're asking them to share things with us. At the same time, that can also help us to look for any deficit that we might see in both their native language and in the English language. That will really help us to decide as educators if we need to look at additional assessments. And with the peer-to-peer support, it is such a great resource. There's such an increase of Spanish speakers in our schools and in our country in general. And so it's a great opportunity to use those students who may have been here longer than others. So we can use those students who speak Spanish, but also have a really great grasp of the English language. They can help us to model different things for those students. So I think, like I said, it's just so important that we use all of those different interventions that are available for our students, especially peers and technology, making sure that we're showing them everything in multiple ways. I think all of those things just are super, super important. And our third question is, why are students who are culturally or linguistically diverse sometimes under or over identified in the special needs realm? I think a lot of these things can both hinder. So I think that can both add to students and kind of decrease as well. So we might see an overrepresentation of these students because our assessment tools aren't appropriate. They're not culturally or linguistically relevant for our students. We wouldn't see students who grew up in America to understand a reading passage about the game of cricket. That's just not something that we're common, that's not common here. So at the same time, we need to make sure that we are looking at it in reverse. Students who grow up in America, they know what football is, but students who grow up pretty much anywhere else in this world hear the word football and they think of what we call soccer. So it's so important that we're making sure that we are making sure how we're testing them makes sense to them in a cultural way. It's also important that we realize that special education services is not a dumping ground for students. We need to find the best place for these students, and special education isn't always it. And by not doing our due diligence, we are seeing an increase of students in SPED support that aren't needed. Also, I think a lot of places have that misconception of, once you're in SPED, you're in SPED, and that's not the case. We need to make sure our students get what they need and then are able to rejoin their peers on an academic level. I think that's really important. We might see students underrepresented as well in special education because a lot of those same characteristics we would see in a deficit, we might also see just in general as English language learners. We might see a student who's struggling and just say, oh, it's because they're learning English because it's a second language. we need to make sure we're really, really looking at those students and identifying what the underlying cause is. Is it because they're learning a second language, or is it because there's a disability there, that there's something that they need additional help with? We might also see an underrepresentation of students because of informal or unwritten rules in the schools that say we need to wait. We need to make sure that these students understand English, that they've gotten a good knowledge base before we test them, before we look for any deficits that we might see. And that's just not the case. And we know that. Another huge misconception is thinking that we can't support these students both in a special education way as well as an English learner way. We can offer both of those things to students, and we need to make sure that despite there being two things, despite there being a lack of bilingual special education providers, that we can do both. There are small things that we can do to help these students, and it is so important that we do that. I think that we do need to see more bilingual or just English language supportive teachers in the special education realm. That's something that's been on my mind lately, and I'm actually hoping that I might be able to get my ELL certificate or something like that, because there is such an increase of students in our schools that speak a second language, and I just think it is so important that we support them just like we support everybody else. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully I aced everything that I was supposed to. Thank you so much.